First thing that I want to mention, I did say last time that we're going to have extended office hours the week after Thanksgiving, right? So I've got figured out now exactly when I'm going to be in the office. It's right up here. So on Wednesday, the 30th of November, I will be in the office from 9 to 12, and then again from 2 to 5. You don't have to make an appointment with me. You can just, you can just show up. That's what office hours are for. The following day, December 1st, I will be in the office from 9 to 5. So I'll be there all day. So anytime you want to come in with a question, or for me to look over your paper, talk about your presentation, whatever, feel free to come by. Hell, even if you just want to come by and chat, I will probably be bored. So feel free. Okay, so before we get started, just again, because we are at that point in the semester, does anybody have any questions today about the paper, about the presentation? Okay, great, good, everything's clear, wonderful. I do want to reiterate that if you want me to look at drafts, please try to get them to me at least 48 hours before the due date, right? I guarantee I will look at it if I get it 48 hours before the due date. If I get it within 48 hours of the due date, I'll still look at it if I have time, but we all tend to get a little bit swamped at this point in the term, right? Myself included. So if you really want the best I can give you, then please follow these particular guidelines. All right, so what we're going to be talking about today is not an easy topic for a lot of people, and I realize that this is an area of discussion that inspires heated opinion on both sides, and so I'm going to really try to be as fair and balanced and historically accurate as I can. Because history is, as we know, a complicated thing, and it's difficult to say in any given situation we haven't been in ourselves who is in the right and who is in the wrong. But there is a long history of difficulty, of rebellion and dissent, of internecine warfare in this particular region. And it would probably help if we start by talking about that a little bit. Right now, the reason we have a conflict in what is now Israel-Palestine to begin with dates back to the 2nd century CE. Right? We go back that far here. Does anybody know what the status politically of this region would have been in the 2nd century? Who would have been in charge here? What was this part of? Think about very, very large Mediterranean world-spanning empires. Ottoman's too late.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. This was a Roman province. It's called Judea. And Judea was a persistent pain in the Roman ass. Right? The people of Judea frequently rose up in revolts against their Roman overlords and were constantly causing political trouble for Romans in the region. And towards the end of the 2nd century, there was a revolt that becomes known as the Bar Kokhba revolts. Large-scale violent rebellion of Judeans against the Roman government. Now, the rebellion is put down, but the Romans, in retaliation, burn down the Jewish temple, which has not since been rebuilt. Right? Do you even know what the Wailing Wall? Have you ever seen pictures of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem? Right? You'll see pictures of people putting messages in the wall and praying for it. That's the last remaining wall of the Second Temple. That's all that's left of it. It was destroyed by the Romans in retaliation for the Bar Kokhba revolts. And this isn't all the Romans do. They ship a lot of the Jewish citizens out of Judea into other parts of the empire, right? They disperse them. And they rename the province of Judea Palestina, after the ancient enemies of the Israelites, the Philistines, right, as a sort of further humiliation.
Oh, that's mean.
So, this is the staging point for much of the later history of the region. Right now, this does become, as you said, Sarah, an Ottoman province. Once the Roman Empire is fallen, once the Byzantine empires, or after the Crusades, the Ottoman Empire, centered in Turkey, takes this part of the world over and rules it until really just after World War I, right, when the Ottoman Empire itself falls in 1922. And so for much of this time, this region is actually pretty sparsely populated. Mostly Arabs working small farms. But then in the 19th century, a movement gets underway in Europe among European Jews called Zionism. What did I do with the eraser? Here we go. Now, are any of you familiar with the term Zionism? Do any of you know what this means?
Where they acknowledge multiple gods, but they only worship one?
That's henotheism.
Oh.
I know, but there have been a lot of isms. Okay. So Zionism is a movement that encourages Jews in the diaspora, right? That is, Jews around the world living outside of the historic state of Israel, to return to Israel to settle there, right? So this gets started really in the 19th century. Leaders like Theodor Herzl so encouraging Jews to move back to the Holy Land, right? To move back to, that old biblical promised land. Now, the early Zionist movement doesn't really make much of the idea of, sort of biblical claims on this land. It's not so much a nationalist movement as it is an economic movement. What they want to do, right, most of the early Zionists are socialists. And what they're interested in doing is going to the historic state of Israel and starting collective farms. Right, so it's part of also sort of building up a kind of Jewish working class political movement. And this is well underway by the time the Ottoman Empire falls in 1922. And this area then falls under the jurisdiction of the British government, right? The Allied powers in the First World War essentially divide up the old Ottoman territories among themselves. So the French, for example, get Syria and Lebanon. The British get what are now Israel and Jordan. And the British administer this province for about 25 years. During which time, the Jewish population increases. It increases dramatically after 1945. Now, why after 1945? Yeah. A lot of Jews don't want to live in Europe anymore after that. So we get mass movement of Jews, especially from Central Europe, into Israel. Many had actually started coming earlier. For example, Yehuda Amichai was born in Bavaria. His family saw the writing on the wall in the 30s and moved to Israel in 1936. But the British Empire itself is falling apart by 1945, right? They've got holdings in South Asia, they've got holdings in the Caribbean, they've got holdings in Africa, and after a large and costly war in both monetary and human terms, it becomes much more difficult for them to hold on to these territories. And Israel in particular becomes restive, right? Jewish militias, for example, form that these sort of paramilitary organizations that make strikes on sites of British authority. Amichai is actually a member of one of these organizations at one point early in his life. And in 1947, the British agreed to divide the territory between the Arab population and the Jewish population and leave. So, according to the UN plan that was drawn up in 1947, this is what the state of Israel was supposed to look like. The orange areas were to be administered by Israeli Jews. The yellow areas were to be administered by Palestinian Arabs. Right? You had a roughly equal apportionment of territory, with the city of Jerusalem, which was religiously and politically important to both groups, as neutral territory administered by the UN. This arrangement didn't last, however, right? That sparsely populated region of Arab farmers that the Ottomans ruled in the early modern period, right? Their population had grown as well. And by the 19th century, they have their own movements towards self-determination, right? Palestinian nationalism right? The sense of Arab Palestine as a distinct nation is a product of the early 19th century. And resistance to what they saw as unfair taxation policies under the Ottoman Empire. Right, so they sort of get a sense of themselves as a group through experiencing what they feel as oppression from a distant political authority and start pushing back against it. Now, to the Palestinian Arabs living in this region, what is it going to look like to them when a bunch of Jewish refugees from Europe start moving in and claiming more and more territory?
They're different. They consider themselves different from them, right? So they're the Palestinians. They consider themselves Israelites too, or
there are. It's complicated. It's very, very complicated.
I know they're still at war with each other.
Yeah,
right?
essentially, like the way the political situation is now, there are essentially three almost independently administered areas within the borders of Israel, right? On the one hand, there is Israel, the Jewish state, and there are Arabs who are Israeli citizens, right? There are Arabs who live within the borders of Jewish-controlled Israel. And just to give you a sense, you're like, this is what was supposed to happen in 1947, right? This is how land was supposed to be apportioned. This is what it looks like now, right, as far as actual political reality is concerned. This is the Jewish-controlled part. These parts are Arab-controlled. So, on the one hand, you have the Gaza Strip at the border with Egypt, on the edge of the Mediterranean. This actually corresponds roughly to the old Philistine territories in the Bible, right? Gaza is, by and large, much more radicalized than the West Bank. This is one of the reasons these are administered sort of separately now, right? Gaza is governed by a Hamas-dominated government. The West Bank is dominated by, what's the name of the other? By the Fatah Party, which is the descendant of the old Palestinian Liberation Organization and tends to be more moderate. The West Bank is also where much of the Israeli settlement activity into Palestinian territory happens. Right, so within Palestinian-controlled territory, there are also these developments. I mean, essentially, like, they look kind of like, let me put it this way, the wealthiest of them look kind of like ordinary suburban cul-de-sacs, right? Which in and of itself is an aesthetic crime. But they look like ordinary suburban cul-de-sacs surrounded by barbed wire and fortifications.
What's fortification?
Pardon?
What was fortification?
Well, big concrete walls, guns, sentry posts, things like that. The smallest of these settlements, sometimes it's, like a couple of people in a trailer on a hill with an Israeli flag on top of it. Those sorts of settlements are usually technically illegal. Right? It's just basically a couple of people who struck out on their own and said, we're going to claim this territory for ourselves. So what all this looks like to a Palestinian Arab in 1947 is a settler culture coming in, right? Much like the encroachment of the little white girl on Chief Mashlanga's village would have looked to his people, right? They don't necessarily see this as Jewish refugees fleeing from oppression in Europe. What they see this as is Europeans coming in here when they were supposed to be leaving and taking this over. So this leads to war between the nascent state of Israel and the surrounding Arab states, right? Egypt, Jordan, Syria. Israel wins the war and wins successive wars in 1967 and in 1973, each time gaining more and more territory. So much of this territory is still in dispute. And even sort of within Israel, there's a great deal of debate over whether or not this is right, what exactly is supposed to be done with the West Bank and Gaza. Do we continue settlement activity? Do we halt settlement activity? Basically, there are two positions that Israeli citizens adopt regarding the West Bank and Gaza. The first position, let's call annexationists. Right? These are people who believe that Israel should just fully annex the West Bank and Gaza, just fully absorb them into the Jewish state of Israel. Now, these are their arguments. Right. First, this will promote security. Right. This will stop Palestinian Arab attacks on Jewish settlements and on the territory of Israel itself, right? If Israel just takes it over. It may not stop the attacks, but it will at least halt, it'll at least slow them down, put a stop to them. Secondly, there's an infrastructure argument, right? That Israel and Palestine are already so thoroughly connected to each other by roads, by water supply, by electrical grids, things like that, that letting go of the occupied territories could cause serious economic problems within Israel. They also worry about the 250,000 or so Jewish settlers that live in the West Bank. Right? That if the political situation continues as it does, or if the West Bank and Gaza are allowed to administer themselves independently, that either exposes those settlers to risk or to potential dislocation, right? Essentially being pushed out of the West Bank and resettled somewhere in the state of Israel. There's also a strong sort of nationalist argument, right? That withdrawal from the biblical promised land, right? From biblical Israel, whatever the practical realities on the ground, is or should be unthinkable. Not everybody who takes an annexationist view is fully on board with all of these arguments. There are a number of Israeli academics, for example, who would argue that annexation is basically already a fact, that Israel already controls so much of the water supply and so many of the resources of the occupied territories that there's really no going back. So it's sort of annexation by default. So that's the annexationist argument. There are also anti-annexationists. Now these people argue, from the standpoint of security, that occupation and annexation actually harms security. Right? Essentially, that if they pulled back from the occupied territories, that would ease tensions, and then we would not have to worry quite so much about attacks. We wouldn't have to worry as much about security. They also argue that the occupation is extremely expensive, right? That Israel doesn't get as much doesn't get enough economic benefit out of it to make it worth the financial cost, or indeed the moral cost of occupation. Right? That, if we do just a simple cost-benefit analysis, right, it costs more to maintain the occupation than it would to end it. They also are concerned about demographics. Right? The founding principle of the State of Israel in 1947 was as a Jewish state, right, where the Jewish people were free to rule themselves and would no longer be subject to the whims of particular European rulers, right, who had often oppressed them in the past. Problem is, despite influxes of new immigrants over the last couple decades from Russia and from Eastern Europe and the United States, the Arab population is growing much faster than the Jewish population. So, if the West Bank and Gaza are fully incorporated into the State of Israel, it will cease to be a Jewish state unless they institute some sort of apartheid and make it less democratic. Finally, they are in fact concerned about, and this is something that speaks actually directly to the Mahmoud Darwish poem that you read for today. They're worried about the exploitation of cheap Arab labor. Right. One of the founding goals of Zionism, you might remember, right? It's not, the goal that was not explicitly nationalist was to create a space for a Jewish working class to develop. But a lot of companies, a lot of contractors can simply hire very cheap labor from very desperate people living in occupied Palestine. And that undercuts wages for the Israeli working class. So it hurts that goal of building a Jewish working class within Israel. Now, from the Palestinian point of view as well, there are also still a number of gripes. And a lot of it has to do with settlement activity. When these new settlements are built in the West Bank, typically the settlers get their own power grid, they get their own water reservoir, they get special highway bypasses that connect them directly to Israel, built for them and only for their use. Meanwhile, Palestinian Arabs who want to get into Israel or need to get into Israel for work often have to endure long and humiliating searches at border outposts. Right? They have to present their identity card. They have to submit themselves to be searched. Often, the Arabs going across don't speak Hebrew. The guards searching them don't speak Arabic. Misunderstandings ensue. So they feel that they are subjected to humiliations that Israelis are not subjected to. And within the state of Israel itself, right, there are, right, as we noted, Arabs who live within the state of Israel as a minority population. There are Arab parties in the Israeli parliament, which is called the Knesset. But there's a tacit agreement amongst all of the Jewish parties in the Knesset never to invite the Arab parties into government coalitions. So I don't know if any of you know anything or follow anything about Israeli politics. I'm going to guess from your silence and looks on your faces that you probably do not. Yes? Yes, okay. So one thing that's weird about Israeli politics is that, it's parliamentary, so most of the governments are coalitions, right? You have a couple of parties that come together and say, we're going to form a government, right? Rather than one party controlling the levers of government. You will find right-wing and left-wing Jewish parties working together in Israeli governments, right? The conservative Likud party, for example, will often go into coalition with the left-wing Labor Party. And the reason they do this is to continue excluding the Arab parties. Right? We make alliance with other Jewish parties rather than including the Arab parties in government. So, a lot of Palestinian Arabs living within these territories feel disenfranchised. They feel that they're treated like second-class citizens, and this breeds a great deal of resentment and often violence. All right, so that's probably actually a good place to sort of find an entry point into the Mahmoud Darwish poem. Now, Darwish is regarded as sort of the official Palestinian poet. He's also the first Palestinian poet to have his work placed on the official high school and university syllabi of the State of Israel, right? So Jewish students would be reading Darwish's work as well, which is very unusual for a Palestinian writer. Now, what did you make of this poem? How did this poem go for you?
Sounds very angry.
Okay, is it really angry throughout? Does it start angry? What does he start with here? If we look at this first little stanza, right, put it on record. I am an Arab, and the number of my card is 50,000. I have 8 children, and the 9th is due after summer. What's there to get angry about? What is he concerned with in this? What's he talking about in this stanza? What sorts of issues does he raise here?
Stereotypes.
Okay, why would you say stereotypes, Sarah?
Because everybody thinks, I guess, that they're supposed to have lots of children and not be able to afford or feed them, I guess.
Yeah, well,
that's a stereotype I hear.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's necessarily pushing back against a particular stereotype, but I think he does note that he has 8, soon to be 9 children for a particular reason, right? I think numbers are really actually very important in this particular stanza. So 8 children, 9th on the way. Where else do we see a number referred to here?
50,000. That's supposed to be his work number?
Yeah, 50,000. Yeah, this is the number on his ID card, right? I am ID card number 50,000. So what we get in this first stanza is the idea of people as numbers, right? Number of children, right? Palestinian citizen number 50,000. Not only that, right? People as growing numbers, increasing. Right? More and more people. What's the basic situation being described? Who is the speaker and where is he? What is he doing?
He's trying to probably go to his job and has to go through like a stop point or like security point or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yep, this is an Arab at a security checkpoint just trying to get to work. And the reference to the family here also indicates why he needs to get to work, right? Right. What's there to get angry about? This is what I have to go through every day, right? This is just the shit I have to put up with. Put it on record. I am an Arab, working with comrades of toil in a quarry. I have 8 children. For them I wrest the loaf of bread, the clothes and exercise books from the rocks, and beg for no alms at your door. Lower not myself at your doorstep. What's there to be angry about? So what are the things about himself he's stressing in the second stanza here?
He's saying that everything he works for, like they're living by, like in nowadays terms, they're living dollar to dollar, and like he's not asking for help. He's just trying to get there.
Yeah, it's like I'm not asking for a handout, right? I work for a living. And he works primarily for who? Well, what's his motivation anyway for working?
Oh, his family.
Yeah, family is the motivation for working, right? For them, I wrest the loaf of bread from the rocks. We'll get back to that image there in a second. But yeah, the clothes and the exercise books, right? School materials so my children can have a better life, right? For that reason, I do what kind of work? What's he doing?
Working in a quarry.
He's working in a quarry, yeah. And the act of quarrying here is actually really important to what's going on in the poem, right? If you work in a quarry, what do?
You break up rock.
Yeah, you break rocks. As opposed to farming, where you would be growing the materials for the loaf of bread, right, that you are going to feed your family. If you're quarrying, you're actually busting that land up, right? You are actively engaged in destroying land. So in order to feed his family, he has to break rocks. He has to wreck the land that he sees as, in some way, his inheritance, right? This is destructive activity compared to farming. Put it on record, I am an Arab. I am a name without a title. Patient in a country where everything lives in a whirlpool of anger. My roots took hold before the birth of time, before the burgeoning of the ages, before cypress and olive trees, before the proliferation of weeds. My father is from the family of the plow, not from high-born nobles. And my grandfather was a peasant without line or genealogy. My house is a watchman's hut made of sticks and reeds. Does my status satisfy you? I am a name without a surname. What do you think of this?
That's him pretty much like de-characterizing himself to them to please them, I guess, and that's him kind of telling like his family history too, like this is what I'm doing, I've been doing it in my family for years.
Yeah, family history is important here, right? Is his family history a history of quarrying? Yeah. What did yeah, exactly. He's a quarryman, but he comes from farmers. He comes from people who worked and tended the land, not people who destroyed it. Right, so, he's proud of his grandfather's peasant heritage, right? His father is a man of the plow because he's proud of the way they tended the land, right? He's proud of the way they took care of this, right? My roots took hold before the birth of time, before the burgeoning of the ages, before the cypress and olive trees, before the proliferation of weeds, right? He sees the land as now sort of going to wreck. Put it on record, I am an Arab, color of hair jet black, color of eyes brown. My distinguishing features, on my head the equal cords over a keffiyeh, scratching him who touches it. My address, I am from a village, remote, forgotten, its streets without name, and all its men in the fields and quarry. Does this sound familiar, the idea of all the men being out in the fields and the quarry? Does this sound familiar? This is a lot like what was going on in Chief Mishlanga's village, right? All of the young men in the village were off working somewhere else, not taking care of the village, right? The forces of international capitalism or imperialist capitalism pushed them off the land and into jobs working for other people. Now, I think the description of the village here is important as well, right? What does he say about his village?
Remote and forgotten.
Remote, forgotten. What kind of place does it sound like?
Sounds pretty crappy.
Okay, sounds pretty crappy, yeah. It's streets without name, right? He gives this as his address, right? My address, right? This is the official place where I reside, right? Where I receive my mail. And he makes it kind of like a no place, right? Streets have no name, it's remote, it's forgotten. And what he's referring to here is actually, what Darwish is referring to, like the character is not meant to be Mahmoud Darwish poet, right? The character is meant to be average Palestinian Arab quarry worker in the 60s. But Darwish himself came from a village that was bulldozed when the state of Israel was founded, right? So he comes from a kind of no place, right? There's no home for him to go back to, ever, right? Home is gone. Home is destroyed. And he's referring to the fact that this was a fairly common occurrence, bless you, in the 40s and the 50s, right? There were a lot of rural Palestinian villages that were destroyed. Sometimes to make way for Israeli settlements, sometimes to make way for various kinds of infrastructure projects. So this guy is from, initially, one of those villages that was destroyed. In the previous stanza, he refers to the fact, his grandfather was a peasant without line or genealogy, but my house is a watchman's hut made of sticks and reeds, right? So my family was connected to the land. Right now, I live in this sort of temporary jerry-rigged dwelling because my home has been destroyed. What's there to be angry about? Put it on record. I am an Arab. You stole my forefathers' vineyards and land I used to till, I and all my children, and you left us and all my grandchildren nothing but these rocks. Will your government be taking them too, as is being said? So, put it on record at the top of page 1. I don't hate people. I trespass on no one's property. And yet, if I were to become hungry, I shall eat the flesh of my usurper. Beware, beware of my hunger and of my anger. So we build from the relative patience and resignation of the beginning of the poem to a kind of violent rage at the end of it, right? Right. I have been putting up with a lot for a very long time. But if you keep pushing me, right, if you push me 1 inch further, I'm gonna snap. And we are gonna come and consume the land that we perceive you as having taken from us. Right? Will your government be taking them too? Is to be like, even the rocks that we quarry, right? Are these going to belong to your government now too? And the main thing that I want you to get from this poem is the basic sort of Palestinian viewpoint of the foundation of the State of Israel. They call the foundation of the State of Israel in 1947 the Nakba, which means catastrophe. Because they don't see this, as I think I said, as refugees coming and looking to escape oppression, right? They see another group of white people coming and spreading out over territory that used to be theirs, right? They see it as a colonial invasion. Right. They don't see Jews, they see Europeans. Because I remember seeing a film a couple years ago. It was a guy who was an Israeli filmmaker, and he was going around talking to children, to Israeli children, to Palestinian children, and trying to gauge their attitudes about, he wanted to ask the Israeli children about Arabs and the Arab children about Israelis. And one of the Arab children he was talking to was saying all kinds of nasty things about Israelis. This was actually a kid who lived within the state of Israel in Jerusalem, in the old city. The filmmaker said, but I'm a Jew and you don't hate me. And the kid said, yeah, but you're an American, that's different. And then he tells the kid, well, actually I'm Israeli, and there's a sort of awkward silence for a while. Right? So there is differentiation between Israeli and Jew with the Palestinian population, right? They don't paint all Jews necessarily with the same broad brush. The anger is largely reserved for Israelis, who they see as an occupying colonial force. Now, to try to cross the divide a little bit here, let's see, where are we for time? We should still have plenty of time, yeah? Pardon?
11:45.
Okay, we got time. Good. All right, so I want to look at the Yehuda Amichai poem, because Amichai was himself a refugee, an immigrant, really a settler, coming into Israel from Germany, right? His real name is Ludwig Pfeiffer, and he emigrates to Israel at the age of 12 in the face of growing anti-Semitism in Germany. So his family is coming to the Middle East looking for a safe space, right? Looking for some place where they will be free from persecution. And they do a lot of pretty impressive things. I mean, they manage to build up a lot of infrastructure quite quickly. And they also manage to essentially resurrect a dead language. Right? Hebrew was primarily a ritual language prior to the resettlement of the state of Israel. You know, people were still using it, but they weren't using it in their daily lives, right? Hebrew was a language of prayers. It was a language you heard in the synagogue. It wasn't a language that you used walking up and down the street. Most European Jews spoke dialect languages depending on where they lived. Right? Northern European Jews spoke Yiddish, which is similar to Germanic languages. And most Mediterranean Jews spoke a language called Ladino, which is similar to Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, French, right? Those sorts of influences. So they were speaking languages that were more or less influenced by where they lived. And then they're coming together in the state of Israel and they can't talk to each other. So they resurrect the traditional language of the Jewish people, and they actually make it into a living language again. This is, I think, as far as I know, this is actually the only example in history of anyone actually bringing a language back from the dead, right? This would be the equivalent of, say, Catholics in Europe getting together and deciding we're going to form a state and we're only going to speak Latin to each other. Right? This is not something that's ever happened before. I don't think it's happened since. So, what this means, Darwish actually had a long tradition of Arabic poetry to draw on. He chooses to throw a lot of that tradition aside and write free verse instead. But Amichai and other Israeli poets of his generation don't have that kind of tradition to lean on. There is not for them a tradition of secular poetry in Hebrew. So he basically invents it out of whole cloth, with influence from American and European poetry, with a great deal of influence from biblical texts. But yeah, it's actually one of the interesting things that archaeologists note in general about even the ancient Israelites is that they produced, as far as we can tell, virtually no non-religious art. It was like virtually no secular art. So, a fun fact for you. But let's look at this first poem on page 934. Are any of you familiar with Psalm 137? Do any of you know this one? It's the By the Rivers of Babylon psalm. Maybe somebody's nodding a little bit. Yeah, it's also been made into reggae songs.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, okay. So let me actually just call this up quickly because I think it will give us a pretty good insight into Amichai's technique. What sorts of things he does. So, okay. So, right, for those who aren't familiar with it, wish that thing worked faster. Let's just make sure we can actually see it. By the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There in the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. So, there are a couple of major themes in this psalm that Amichai is revising in his particular poem, right? What's the basic situation in this psalm? Where is the speaker?
He's being held captive.
Yeah, he's in exile, right? He's in exile being held captive in a foreign city. So that's thing one to remember. Right, exile in a foreign land. Okay, good. What else? What is demanded of him in this foreign land?
For him to play music that was from the Holy Land.
Yeah, sing us songs of your homeland, right? So he's commanded to sing. And what feeling does this command to sing provoke in him? Does he feel he can adequately sing, cut off from his homeland? No, he can't, right? Right. Needs his connection to, his memory of his homeland in order to do so. Right? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand lose its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, right? May I not be able to play the harp. May I not be able to speak. And then, in that final stanza, what do his thoughts tend towards? What emotion is he expressing in the final stanza, or what is he predicting?
When
Revenge.
Yeah. Right. We will get back at those who took us from our homeland. All right, so that's the psalm that Amichai is working with here. That's the basic material that he's working with. A lot of his poems are essentially revisions or rewritings of biblical literature. So, can I get somebody to read the first stanza on page 934, If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem?
Alright. If I forget thee, Jerusalem, then let my right be forgotten. Let my right be forgotten, and my left remember. Let my left remember, and your right close, and your mouth open near the gate.
Okay, so what images is he borrowing here directly? What images or languages is he borrowing directly from the psalm?
forgotten.
Okay, forgotten. Right. If I forget thee, Jerusalem. What else is he taking directly from the psalm here?
Right.
Okay, yep, right and left. And what else? Is there another body part that's mentioned?
Mouth.
The mouth, the idea of the mouth, right? Now, what is the mouth doing in Psalm 137?
It was shut.
Yeah, it's a shut mouth, right? May my tongue fuse to the roof of my mouth, right? But here we have an open, your mouth, not his own mouth. The mouth of Jerusalem, open, near the gate. Now, what about the right and left here? Now, what does the right refer to in the psalm? The skill of what? Playing an instrument. And what does he use to play the instrument? Hand, right? Skill of his hand. What term of reference is missing from this stanza when he talks about right and left? Yeah, he doesn't specifically mention the hand, right? He leaves kind of open what right and left refer to. On the one hand, right, these are directions, right? Right and left. But what else might right and left refer to?
The brain.
Okay, could refer to hemispheres of the brain.
Right and wrong.
Right and wrong. Yeah. Right, the right-hand path versus the left-hand path. So could be reference to a moral compass. What else? If we don't think of these terms in relation to each other, right? If we take them each individually, what else is a right?
Like, you know, rights as in humane rights?
Yeah. That could be one of the sorts of things he's talking about. You know, a right, right? Something to which you're entitled. And then if we think of left, apart from its relationship to right, what does left mean?
Abandoned.
Abandoned, yep, to go someplace else, right? Good. So we have to think of this in the context of the resettlement of the state of Israel by exiles, right? Psalm 137 was about being stuck someplace else, right? Being captive someplace else, unable to leave, forced to do the bidding of your captor. Now, what he's talking about here, in If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem, right? His people have come back to the land they regard as their birthright, and they have left, they have abandoned other places, right? So really what he's playing on that particular psalm's tension between home and exile and taking it in a different direction. Where do you go? What do you do when, in a sense, your home is exile? Right? When your spiritual home, the home you've come back to, means leaving behind the actual physical home you were born in and the connections you've made there, the life you had there. So what he's talking about here is the sort of disconnects in the mind of the European Jew emigrating to Israel, right? This is supposed to be home, right? This is where, you know, all of our scriptures, all of our culture sort of tells us to go back to. It doesn't really feel like home, right? There's still something about it that seems kind of strange and alien. And I think, like, this is one of the reasons why he's so good at talking about tourist perspectives in his poetry. We only have about 10 minutes left. Let's turn briefly to page 937, to the poem Tourists. Can I get a volunteer to read those first two stanzas, please?
So condolence visits.
Thank you, James.
Is what they're here for. Sitting around at the Holocaust Memorial, putting on a serious face at the Wailing Wall, laughing behind heavy curtains in hotel rooms. They get themselves photographed with the important dead at Rachel's tomb and Herzl's tomb, and up on Ammunition Hill. They weep at the beautiful prowess of our boys' lust after our tough girls, and hang up their underwear to dry quickly in cool blue bathrooms.
All right, thank you very much. So, what does the tourist experience of Israel look like to Amichai?
They disrespect their history.
Pardon?
They disrespect their history.
Okay, what about what about their attitude towards the history seems disrespectful to you, Chris?
The fact that they're laughing about the Holocaust memorial behind their backs.
Yeah, okay, yeah, they're only serious when they're going to the monuments, right? This isn't, they're here on one sense maybe to connect with history, to connect with heritage, but once they're not actually in direct contact with that history or heritage, it's forgotten, right? They're laughing in their hotel rooms, right? We put on a serious face at the Wailing Wall. We act serious at the Wailing Wall, even though we don't necessarily feel anything there. Right? You act serious because you're supposed to, because this is a holy place of great historical importance. Do we see something similar going on in the second stanza? What are they doing the moment they leave Ammunition Hill, Rachel's tomb, and Herzl's tomb?
They're going to dry their underwear.
Okay, they're going to dry their underwear. And in between that, right, they're looking and thinking lustfully at attractive young Israelis, right? So they go to the historical sites, they look around, maybe looking to hook up, and then they go back to the hotel room and dry their underwear, right? So the tourists' attachment to the country is only to particular sites and then to the pleasures they can get out of it, right? And if we look at the prose portion on 938, part 2 of this poem, can I get a volunteer to read this?
Once I was sitting on the steps
Thank you,
of the
sir.
gate at David's Citadel, and I put down my 2 heavy baskets beside me. A group of tourists stood there around their guide, and I became their point of reference. You see that man over there with the baskets? A little to the right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period. A little to the right of his head, but he's moving, I said to myself. Redemption will come only when they are told. Do you see that arch over there from the Roman period? It doesn't matter. The near it, a little to the left, and then down a bit. There's a man who just bought fruit and vegetables for his family.
So what's the situation he's pointing to here? What's he being used as by the tour guide? What is his meaning to the group of tourists?
So look at the people and the history and the place instead of like rather the momentums and stuff.
Yeah, that seems to be basically the argument he's making, right? If you really want to get to know a place, you want to know what's important about a place, right? It's not the moldy old objects hanging around all over the place that really tell you anything about it, right? Yes, there's a Roman arch over there. And he objects to being used by the tour guide as just a point of reference for the tourists to find the Roman arch, right? That's the thing that's important. Actually, why not use the Roman arch as a point of reference to talk about the human beings walking around it, right? We're what's important. The human life here is what's important. And redemption will only come, understanding will only come, when people realize that what's really most important are other people and their daily lives. The attitude that Amichai tends to take towards Jerusalem is the attitude that a lot of city dwellers take. Like if you live in a big, old, important city with lots of, tourist sites all over it. I lived for a while in New York City. I lived in Washington, D.C. which are some of the, my wife is from Philadelphia. These are some of the great U.S. equivalent, they're not nearly as old as a city like Jerusalem, but they're the sorts of places you go to see all kinds of, historical tourist sites, right? Ooh, let's go to the Statue of Liberty, right? Ooh, let's go to the Lincoln Memorial, right? If you live in these places, you never go there. Right? Why? You're too busy, right? No, I have to get to work. No, I have to go to the store, right? No, I'm not gonna spend my weekend off trucking out to Ellis Island or going up the Statue of Liberty, right? I'm just gonna go to the bar and have a beer with my friends. You only go to these places if people come to visit you from out of town, because by and large their only frame of reference for the place where you live is these tourist sites they've heard about or seen on TV. I remember when I graduated from college and I moved to New York, I had all these elderly relatives who had never been there telling me all the things I needed to see and also telling me which neighborhoods to avoid, right? Oh, don't go there, it's dangerous. How the fuck do you know? Right? You've never been there. Thanks, Grandma. I'll keep it in mind. But yeah, that's the attitude that Amichai takes towards Jerusalem. He's much more interested in the daily life and the daily rhythms of the city than he is in all of the old stuff lying around. And I think we can also chalk that up to the idea of being a kind of returned exile as well, right? If you focus too much on these past things, if you focus on all of these tombs and all of these historical artifacts, that makes it much, much harder to heal community divides. Right? These are also the things that people in Israel fight over. I remember, I think, maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, there was a rash of stabbings over who has access to the Temple Mount. Right, because there's one of the holiest mosques in Islam is built on the Temple Mount, but the Wailing Wall is there as well. Right? There are also various, sacred Jewish sites, and the most conservative elements of both communities are always fighting over who gets to claim that space, right? Who gets access to that space? Who gets to say it's theirs? And both sides are always worried that the other side is going to bar them from it. And I think what Amichai is trying to discourage people from doing is looking at Jerusalem as this set of historic sacred spaces, and instead as just, a city with rhythms like any other. Does that make sense? All right, well, I think we are running pretty close to time here. And does anybody have any questions about any of this? Yeah, James.
Why was the second portion of this written in prose?
It's just the way he wrote the poem. And I think it is, again, to sort of draw your attention to the everyday in the quotidian, right? It's like, okay, I'm just going to write this in normal, everyday sort of speech kind of language, rather than in sort of language made strange of the poem. Yeah, Chris?
Unrelated, but how soon are you going to send out the missed writing, so to get a time frame when you know?
Yeah, my plan is to do that tomorrow. Yeah, I just I only have time to do things like that by and large over the weekend. So yeah, tomorrow, Saturday at the latest.
Okay, I was just wondering what you said.
Okay, and I do want to make sure, does everybody feel that I've been more or less fair about this? Okay. I don't, I don't want to offend anybody. I don't want to represent this inaccurately, and I don't want to represent this in a way that is hurtful. All right, so, all right, I have reading questions for you for next time. We're going to be looking at another work of African literature, in this case written by an author of mixed race from South Africa. Let's just get